population, still going strong. And we managed to build that into a sizable organization, and in the process pioneer some a public-private partnership approach to revitalizing cities that was a terrific experience. After 13 years there, I returned to Boston to Harvard across the river, where I had a senior administrative role as Vice President for Government and Community Affairs, and also taught at the Harvard Business School, and that was followed by the opportunity about 8 years ago to join the Boston Foundation, one of the leading community foundations in the country. So I've been in city government and city politics, the nonprofit world on a national basis, higher education, and now a major philanthropy. But in every one of those chapters was fundamentally concerned with cities, or this city in particular. And as part of the introduction tonight, I thought I might, in addition to telling you a little bit about myself, confess what some of my perspectives and biases are as we go forward in this exercise, so that you can recognize when they're on display. And my starting point is very much when I started in 1975 as an aide to Kevin White. Boston was a very, very different place in 1975, as some of you in this audience will well remember. And it's getting harder and harder to remember just what kind of tough shape this city was in, given the renaissance that has occurred, and by any relative standard, Boston is just an incredibly healthy and vital place compared to that period. Because Boston was a full participant in the urban crisis that began shortly after World War II, that afflicted really all major American cities, but particularly the older cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. That crisis was catalyzed by an enormous exodus from the American city. Just millions and millions of people who lived in cities, who've been brought up in cities, decamped for the leafy suburbs, for that single-family home on a lot with a white picket fence. That version of the American dream was very, very powerful. There's a big argument, I think, among urban historians about whether that was a natural outflow or whether it was really produced by a series of national policies that really subsidized that exodus. On the one hand, cities were crowded, dirty, corrupt, afflicted with many, many problems. On the other hand, through tax policy, through transportation policy, through housing policy, it's now clear that the federal government provided enormous incentives for people to leave the cities, and leave the cities in droves. They did. Boston, once contained in the city proper about 800,000 people. That dropped to the high 4s at the low point. Some of that population has now been restored and may be at about 600,000 now. But we contained far fewer people than we did in the 1940s and 50s. And the population decline has been even more dramatic in many other cities. Barry's hometown of Detroit, what's the population decline been, Barry? Remind me, in Detroit?
50–60%.
Yeah, 50 to 60%. This exodus of people, of course, caused a subsequent exodus of commerce. As the jobs, the economic vitality followed the people, the growing suburbs, and so you saw the economic decline following the population decline. Given that these cities had been built to contain far more people, and there were no longer enough people to keep it all up, what you began to see was spreading blight throughout all American cities, abandoned houses and businesses, dilapidated neighborhood commercial corridors, weed-filled empty lots, and so forth. And that kind of vision became very strongly associated with the American city during that period of crisis. And then, of course, you were having major racial change at the same time. Cities becoming more and more black and brown as the white middle class exited. You had tremendous concentrations of impoverished people and a kind of social implosion and chaos, high crime, broken families, and so forth that, again, became very strongly associated with the idea of the American city. Even Boston exhibited all of these characteristics, even with all of our students and our great universities. They were not enough to keep the city above these problems. And the pervasiveness of this crisis, the direness of these circumstances, led many to conclude that the American city was headed for the dustbin of history, that really this decline was going to continue indefinitely as more people and jobs exited, and that there really was not any way back from these circumstances. And that pessimism was fed also in part by the apparent failure, or at least that became the popular verdict, the apparent failure of a set of federal programs, beginning with the Johnson administration, that attacked poverty and attempted urban revival in various forms. Those programs appeared not to have arrested the accelerating decline. So a kind of consensus among the knowledgeable formed, and this was apparent on many college campuses, including Harvard. Many scholars believed that this decline was permanent, and some didn't really lament this decline. After all, these cities, as Barry will take us through tonight and in future sessions, these cities were developed around a set of economic transactions that needed to be close to one another. That was their rationale, essentially, for existing. And technology had, in many ways, removed the necessity for these functions to be clustered closer together. The dramatic drops in the cost of transportation, for instance, appeared to make it unnecessary for a set of industrial functions that formerly had to be close together to be close together. So the thought was, well, you know, that there was an economic rationale for these cities that had now disappeared. The growth, the action is in the suburbs. It's a new form of settlement. Why do we need these cities anyway? Very interesting view. And the pessimism was very, very complete. This pessimism came home to me very dramatically in 1975, shortly after I joined the White administration. At that time, Kevin White was working with the renowned mall developer, Jim Rouse, now the late Jim Rouse, wonderful, wonderful man, really visionary. They were working on this idea of reviving the Faneuil Hall marketplace, which was in a decrepit state, again, as some of you will remember. And they had this visionary idea of restoring this kind of marketplace and this, what would be the center, this gathering place that would kind of resurrect one of the features of cities that couldn't be replicated in suburbs. But as they went around to the great financial institutions of this city, and we had a lot of them back then, a lot more banks, hometown banks and insurance companies than we have now. And they pitched this idea, and they were looking to raise financing, and they got all the meetings with the highest level people. And what they heard from everyone, every CEO of a Boston bank and a Boston insurance company, they said, boy, Mr. Mayor, we admire what you're trying to do. It's really praiseworthy, but this will never fly. This will never fly. So guess how much money they raised from Boston's own financial institutions to invest in the historic heart and center of the city? Not one dime. Not one dime. Fortunately, they raised the money elsewhere, and the rest is history. Faneuil Hall Marketplace was resurrected and became this, indeed, as Kevin White knew it would, became this shining example of how cities are different, why they're different, and they may not be for everybody, but they're very appealing to some. And Faneuil Hall Marketplace, in turn, sparked at least a modest revival in some confidence that the city had a future. And of course, in the intervening years, Boston has undergone a tremendous renaissance that we talk about. Now, in addition to this pessimism about World War II, I think something else is important to acknowledge in the American mindset about cities. We're ambivalent about cities as a culture. Very, very different than how people feel about their cities in Europe. For me, Thomas Jefferson said it all when he described cities as those entities that contain all that is pestilential to the health and morals of mankind. Of course, Thomas Jefferson sampled those pestilential things in Paris quite literally, as we know, but this was his message, and of course, it spoke to that agrarian ideal that dominated thinking about what was special and distinctive. And part of why America was superior is that it didn't have these bad old, corrupt, diseased cities that were being left behind in Europe. So that's why we're never quite sure if cities are a good idea or not. And the terrible decline after World War II seemed to confirm that perhaps we could live without the American city. But in Boston and other cities, not all, but in other cities, a tremendous turnaround began. The seeds were planted in some cases in the 70s and early 80s, but that turnaround really came to fruition in Boston and New York and Chicago and other cities in the 90s, driven in part by 90s prosperity, which was extraordinary. That was perhaps a necessary, though, but not a sufficient condition for the city's revival, because after all, there had been other economic booms during which the American city continued to decline. Now, some things were changing. In part, it was a return, at least among some segments of the population, a return of some affection for the distinctiveness of urban living, a recognition that there are things that go on in cities, there are things that are possible that are not possible elsewhere. And this new affection or attraction to urban living was certainly began to be exhibited by some segments of the elderly population, and now aging baby boomers who may have raised their children in the suburbs in order to get high-quality schools, but when the children are gone, why is that big house necessary? And wouldn't it be fun to be in the middle of all these restaurants and down the street from cultural attractions and participating in this liveliness of the city? Similarly, the young are displaying great affection for being in the cities with the art scene, the music scene, the urban buzz that people talk about. There were urban visionaries like Kevin White, who at the darkest and lowest moments held out this vision of a better day and a return to urban vitality, and they fought for the city, and they began to restore those things that exhibited those urban attributes. They understood that there was a new future in formerly industrial and now moribund waterfronts that could be very, very attractive for both commercial and residential development. They understood that urban neighborhoods could potentially be a draw if city services were good, if they were made safe and vital again. And as I do talk about in my book, Comeback Cities, there developed an utterly remarkable grassroots revitalization movement across the country in urban America. Community development corporations, housing nonprofits, other groups that over time, aided by the government and the private sector, undertook remarkable and incredibly successful revitalization efforts that would have been viewed as highly implausible from the vantage point of a decade or two earlier. In fact, in Boston, at one point, of course, in the 60s and 70s, as I mentioned, there was extensive blight in Boston. It was a contagion. And by the end of the 90s, physical blight had been virtually erased in the entire city of Boston. You could actually have a conversation with our mayor, which we hope to do in this course, at the end, and ask him, are there any abandoned buildings in Boston left? And the mayor would say, yeah, there are a couple. There's one over on, et cetera, which is just an unbelievable conversation to have, given the oceans of blight that have afflicted places like Roxbury and Dorchester and even Jamaica Plain, now a vibrant neighborhood in those days. So there was a tremendous turnaround, and in Boston, of course, this was aided by a general economic transformation that Barry will discuss, I'm sure, in more detail. But Boston's unique attributes, of course, are highly favored at the moment, given economic trends. We've made virtually a complete conversion from the industrial area to a so-called knowledge economy that rests on higher education, healthcare, finance, technology. And our job growth is not nearly as robust as we need it to be, but those are the elements of a very strong and forward-looking innovation economy. We also have among the highest skilled workforces in the world, in our city and in our state, with more than 40% of the workforce having a bachelor's degree or higher, which is perhaps the strongest indication of what your economic prospects are in a knowledge economy. So I guess one way to put this is that Boston, that we will be referring to, not exclusively, but constantly in this course, I think we have to remember it is both typical in certain respects of many other cities in terms of the kinds of problems it continues to have: extensive poverty, a failing public school system, large numbers of unskilled immigrants, unacceptably high youth violence. I mean, Boston is a city, and it has big city problems, but it is also an outlier among American cities on the positive side because of that economic strength. I mean, think about it. 8 research universities inside Route 128. There isn't another place in the world that has remotely that kind of intellectual firepower, not to mention the 70-some additional colleges in the metropolitan area, the 250,000 students, the incredible flow of research dollars into the city. It's an innovation capital. I mean, you can say about Boston, very important aspects of the human future are likely to be determined and invented here in this community. So I think we need to remember that Boston is also among a handful of American cities that are globally significant. Boston is a very, very important place, not just in Massachusetts, not just in America, but in the world. And for such a small city to play such a large role is very, very unusual. So I think we have this interesting opportunity to look at Boston both as an outlier and as, in other ways, a typical American city. To go directly to some biases I have, my problem with the ambivalence that America has about its cities and the toleration we have had at various points for urban decline is that, contrary to what most people think about cities, I think it's extremely damaging to our whole civilization to have cities in less than a very vital state. So a proposition that I just wanted to put out tonight in this opening session is that cities are critical, not just to the people and the businesses who happen to be there, but to the entire civilization, because they make a kind of contribution to that civilization that can't be made in any other ways. And I think the nature of that contribution is in innovations of all kinds. In cities are clustered the people and the resources which generally produce the big innovations that drive our society forward, whether those innovations are in government, in business, in technology, in medicine, or in the social sector, for that matter, where Boston is a tremendous hotbed of innovation. So if cities are weak, we are depriving ourselves of valuable innovations that we all need. Cities also make a tremendous and unduplicated contribution to diversity and tolerance of difference. We are all familiar with the chronic American intolerance of the kind that has been well chronicled by our great novelists like Sinclair Lewis and others. Cities are very, very different. It's true there can be great intolerance in cities, and this city was convulsed by extended racial conflict in the 1970s around the issue of school desegregation, but it is that same city that has made an incredible recovery from those days and now exhibits a level of racial tolerance that for any of us who were here in those dark days is simply astonishing. Cities contain crucial economic assets that are vital to the entire economic enterprise. 80% of the people, I think close to 90%, correct me if I'm wrong, Barry, of our GDP now is emanating from metropolitan areas, and within the center cities are disproportionate share of crucial economic assets like the great research universities, the teaching hospitals, the colleges, and the technology companies, et cetera, that are vital. So key economic assets exist in these center cities. Next, cities are vital for opportunity. Why do people flock to cities? They flock to them for opportunity. Jane Jacobs once said, the cities don't need to attract the middle class, they need to create the middle class. If we are going to unlock opportunity at scale for those who need it, be they the recently arrived immigrant or the native African American sons and daughters struggling under great adversity, that opportunity will be unlocked or not in the American city. And finally, I would mention that the cities contain very disproportionately the entire cultural patrimony of this civilization and this nation. Where are the great museums, the great collections, the great music institutions? They are in the cities. And if you believe, as I do, that maintaining that culture and adding to that cultural patrimony and vitality is critical, again, the lion's share of that will occur and be contributed by the American city. I could go on, but that is all the way of saying that I think there's more at stake here than the cities themselves. And we have been, as a society, far too indifferent to the negative consequences of urban decline. The other lesson in all this, I think, is that there is no permanent success for the American city, but there also need not be permanent failure. Just in the last 100 years, there have been tremendous cycles and swings, and again, Barry will talk to us about some of this with the relevant data. And so at a low point, visionaries like Kevin White and otherwise have an opportunity to dream of and to begin to catalyze a successful future. But the successful cities, like Boston at the moment, if they are complacent about that success, they will be very, very sorry indeed. Boston went from an incredibly vital city in the late 19th and early 20th century into an economic, political, and cultural decline that lasted more than 50 years before this latest resurrection began. So it is both sobering and heartening that there is no permanent success and no permanent failure. Finally, what are some of the issues that I think are of particular interest at the moment? Well, the issue that's always of interest is, what is it going to take for the American city to thrive in the 21st century in the global context? And we will be attacking that question in a whole bunch of ways. But two other questions I think are particularly interesting at the moment, and one is the whole question of educational opportunity. Will we be able to unlock the productivity, which is very, very necessary for Black and Hispanic children, recently arrived immigrants, so that they can be full participants in the American dream? Can we build the structures of opportunity to do that? We have not done that yet, as the continuing grim statistics emanating from our cities indicate. But there is hope. There have been breakthroughs. Will we embrace those breakthroughs on a broad basis? I think an issue of great moment, which creates an opportunity for the American city, again, to make a distinctive contribution to the entire civilization, is the whole energy and climate change situation, where cities are not the problem, they are the answer. Per capita energy use in cities is far lower. The cities are inherently far more efficient. than the suburbs or the exurbs, but there is a further opportunity for cities to lead the way in pioneering dramatic energy and conservation efforts that could make an outsized contribution to the necessary fight to preserve a habitable climate. These and many other fascinating questions will preoccupy us, and as Barry took us through, we have assembled a group of guests that are real. They're going to be delightful, they're going to be provocative, but they're also going to, along with all the data and the scholarship that we will look at, they're going to talk about the real choices that they and we face every day in the American cities. So believe me, for this enterprise, I'm very much more the student than the professor, and I'm delighted to see you all here tonight. Thank
you. There's not a lot to say after that, but I think that really sets the stage so wonderfully in terms of what we're going to be trying to do this semester. The idea, I came from the city of Detroit in 1971. Growing up in Detroit in 1950s and 1960s, and it's hard to believe if you know anything about Detroit today, that Detroit was the richest city in the United States. Had the highest median family income of any city in the United States, which essentially made it the richest city in the world. It not only had the highest median family income for whites, it had the highest median family income for blacks. Of course, a lot of that was based on the auto industry, and today they don't have the same auto industry they had back then. But when I arrived here in Boston in 1971, thinking I'd only stay here for a year or two before going back to the Midwest, but fell in love with the city, I was rather surprised to find in 1971 a city that seemed, in fact, much more deteriorated, in much worse shape, and going in the wrong direction relative to Detroit. I thought of this as the city on the hill. I'd heard of a university called Harvard, they have here, understand, and MIT. I don't think I'd heard of Northeastern yet. But I just assumed that this was going to be a place of great intellectual understanding of the way cities would work, and a place of great tolerance. Of course, I came at a time when just the opposite seemed to be true. And then you look at this Renaissance. In fact, one of the other books, and I'm not going to ask you to buy it, one of the other books we use is a book I also authored. My friends Mary Huff Stevenson and Russ Williams. Mary is at UMass Boston, and Russ is at Wheaton, and they'll be joining us for the next two sessions about the book we then did later. But we, in fact, titled our book The Boston Renaissance. It came out in 2000, but it was really kind of cataloging how this change occurred. Well, I want to go through, maybe John, you could help me here, a few statistics and some data. We'll do that very quickly, and we'll take a break to kind of set this up, because as Paul said, I hope this will be a time that we really explore the city with all of its passion, with all of its excitement, but we also want to take a look at some of the numbers and take a look at some of the issues. So let's first of all ask the question, and Paul touched on some of this, what makes cities special? The number one thing that makes cities special is density. That's what's different about cities relative to rural areas or ex-urban areas, where lots of people are close together. And where you have density, you often have diversity. If you have more people, it's more likely you're going to have diversity. If not by race and gender and age, by other things. So cities are marked by density and diversity. They're also, when you bring lots and lots of people together, you get what economists call externalities. Some of those are positive externalities. Those are the kinds of things when you are affected by somebody else's transaction in a positive way. The best way I like to talk about it is I happen to live in the city of Cambridge. And for the first few years when I lived in the house where my wife and I live, we had a wonderful woman who lived next door to us, an older woman, Mrs. Ferzoli, whose husband had been the superintendent of the Cambridge Public Schools, I understand. And she loved roses. And she planted her whole backyard with just a marvelous array of pink and white and red roses. And I absolutely love them, and from our third floor apartment during the spring and summer, I could look down on her roses, of which I didn't pay for a single cent of its production, and enjoy them. And in that way had a tremendous positive externality. Cities, however, also have negative externalities. My wife, unfortunately, is allergic to roses. And so when these roses came out in the spring, while I reveled in their beauty and their aroma, my wife began to cry, literally. And for her, this was a negative externality. She was affected by somebody else's production of something. Well, in cities, of course, we have all kinds of positive and negative externalities. The closer we live together, the more likely we'll have externalities of both types. And the real question is, how do you increase the number of positive externalities, and how do you reduce the number of negative externalities? We also have, and Paul touched on it beautifully, what we call the love-hate relationship with central cities. I love the central city. I love everything about it. But there are a lot of people who find it noisy. There are a lot of people who are very anxious when they're in the cities, walking around, particularly after dark. And they find other places much better. And then we have love-hate relationship with suburbs. Some people just love the suburbs, having their own backyard, being able to go out every week and mow the lawn. Quiet birds singing, coyotes going through the backyard. And yet, when you think about it, when you think about the ticky-tacky little houses that we heard about folk songs in the 1960s and 70s, we have a love-hate relationship with the suburbs as well. Indeed, I very seldom like to quote from Barry Bluestone, but I kind of like the first paragraph of our book. This was not actually written by me, but my colleague, Mary Stevenson. Our book starts with a two-word sentence. Place matters. Place matters. Whether it's the exhilaration some of us feel when the hometown team wins the big game, or the desire to escape our surroundings and seek our fortune elsewhere, or paradoxically, the ability to feel both sentiments simultaneously, we care passionately about the places where we live. Even when we choose to leave the places where we grew up, we are often nostalgic for the old neighborhood or the old country. We carry our origins with us even as we reinvent ourselves, crafting lives that are different from those of our parents or grandparents. While the reach of technology, radio, television, and the internet permits us to share more in common, the place we call home still affects us in profound ways. That's the way I think about cities. If we were to ask what are the basic social functions that cities perform, one of the most important is the large-scale production of goods and services. It's a place where we bring lots of people together to produce lots of things. Much of it for sale elsewhere, as exports to the rest of the world, which may be from Boston to Cambridge, or vice versa. It is a place of technical and social innovations, Paul so eloquently reminded us. It is a place where we try and provide a desirable residential environment for our families, our children, to live in. It is a place to provide a social support network for residents, in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of cultural amenities. It is a place where we can live and have some passion in our life. If you think about the large-scale production of goods and services, the most important thing for a city to do, or one of the most important things, is to maintain and generate export activities, or what economists call the economic base. If you think about it, each one of us exports a few things in order to import everything else. I export the good or service of being a professor here at Northeastern University. In return, somehow I get a paycheck, and based on that export of goods of teaching and research, I get to buy everything from food to my automobile to tickets to the lyric stage next week. The ability of communities to produce things that other people desire and purchase provides us with the opportunity to get the resources to purchase large amounts of things that we would never produce on our own. We also have to maintain and generate production for local use. The local hotel, the local restaurant, the barber, the hairdresser. We need to provide employment and earnings to residents and others in the region in the course of both generating export activities and production for local use. This is how people buy things. We have to maintain, improve, and replace the stock of non-residential structures in a city. Our industrial, our commercial, and public buildings. Rebuilding Faneuil Hall. Rebuilding through creative destruction older buildings that get repurposed for either housing or for new commercial activities. And we have to maintain a labor pool of varying skills and specializations, which means that we need to have an education system, a training system to do that. As Paul said, cities are places of technical and social innovation. We stimulate innovations which lead to higher productivity. Innovation is the way societies prosper. Without innovations, prosperity is impossible. And most of those innovations, many of those innovations, occur in cities where people with diverse skills come together, and together develop new ways of doing things. We need to provide the means for communications, to provide higher education programs, to provide households with the opportunities for upward mobility through learning more skills and improving their ability to earn. Provide centralized facilities for face-to-face contacts between lawyers or doctors and patients, or between students and faculty. To provide opportunities for employment, education, the exercise of leadership for groups, through all the community groups, neighborhood associations that we have. The residential environment. We need to maintain, improve, and replace the stock of residential structures. We need to provide neighborhood amenities, attractive appearance, safety, freedom from excessive noise and social interactions. Provide retail facilities for residents. We need to have a social support system in our cities. Providing, of course, educational programs for our kids, providing cultural, recreational, religious, and entertainment services and facilities, providing healthcare services and facilities, and we need to have a way to govern ourselves. Provide an effective system of justice for settling conflicts. Maintain an efficient and equitable system of taxation to support government functions. Maintain government institutions for coping with changes in local conditions. And facilitate citizens' participation in local government decisions. And then there are a set of support functions, providing for public order and personal security. Providing and maintaining the transportation system. Providing a system for collecting capital to finance consumer, business, government, and other activities. Providing and distributing energy resources. Maintaining and improving and replacing the physical infrastructure of the city, transportation, roads, bridges. Disposing of waste, and protecting the environment. All of these are things that cities need to do. And when they do them well, there's economic prosperity. When we think about economic prosperity, we first of all think about context of urban change. The macroeconomics. National economic policy affects what happens in the Commonwealth, what happens in Boston. Technological changes affect our ability to become more prosperous, as we've seen and in Paul's comments, we know. In demographic changes, we have an aging society, nationwide, more so here in Massachusetts than most places. We have to deal with the question of uneven growth of metro areas, uneven growth within the metro areas, between those who are advantaged and those who are disadvantaged. The uneven growth between metro areas of Boston on the one hand and Detroit on the other. We have to deal with questions of income inequality within and among metro areas. These are critical issues in urban policy. Of course, we are particularly interested in inner city neighborhoods and how they survive. We need to understand all of these issues that affect our economic prosperity and how that prosperity is distributed among our people. So that is a very, very quick overview of the kind of key issues that academics think about, starting from the whole idea of density and diversity to the kinds of functions that cities have to perform in order to maintain, survive, and prosper. So let's just quickly, before we take a break, look at the changing fortunes of metro areas. And these are data that we put together on 20 cities. And the very first one you'll see is metro area median family income for 1970, controlling for inflation. All of this is in 2005 dollars. Okay. Median family income refers to incomes, of course, of family units. Median refers to the family unit that is in the middle of a distribution from the very poorest family to the very highest, very richest family. If you were to if I were to take everybody in this class and ask you to fill out in an index card your age or your income, and then I sorted them from lowest to highest, and there were 220 of you in the room, and I went to the 110th, that would be the median. Right? And the reason why we, by the way, we look at medians, just a little factoid, the reason why we look at medians is if you have a very skewed distribution of income with a few extremely wealthy people, the average income can be much higher than the typical income. By looking at the median, even if you get somebody who doubles their income at the very top, it doesn't affect the middle. So, that's a good number to look at. In 1970, of the 20 cities we looked at here, and we looked at 20 cities across the country, the city with the highest metro area, city and suburb, median family income was indeed my hometown of Detroit, at about $64,000. Boston was at about $59,000, and Raleigh, North Carolina, was at about $45,000, $18,000, $19,000 less than Detroit, and Austin, Texas was a little bit below that. By 2005, that list had changed quite a bit. Detroit, which had been number 1, and this is the whole metro area including the wealthy suburbs, was now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11th out of 20. Raleigh and Austin, which had been at the very bottom, were now above Detroit. That's the difference between 1970 and 2005, 25 years. Right? So something was happening in Raleigh and Austin which increased their prosperity dramatically, and something was happening in Detroit that was going the other direction. Indeed, by 2005, the median family income in Detroit, controlling it for inflation, was actually lower than it was in 1970. Again, we're not talking about the inner city. We're talking about the whole metro region, including all of the wealthy suburbs, including the Grosse Points and Troy, Michigan, and Boyle, Birmingham, and Bloomfield Hills, if you know the communities I'm talking about. If you look at central cities, so you're looking at Boston per se, you're looking at Detroit per se, you're excluding the metro areas. In 2005, the highest income was in San Francisco at $73,000. Boston was around $50,000 in the central city. Detroit was at $28,984. Detroit was barely 1/3 of what San Francisco was in the central city. If you look at the suburbs, exclude the city, New York had the highest median family income at over $81,000. Boston, suburbs, put them 4th at $80,000. Detroit, suburbs, were down at around $70,000. Raleigh was at about $65,000. Tucson, about $59,000. Massive differences in those figures. If you then said, hey, how are the suburbs doing relative to the city in terms of median family income, you'll find out that people who lived in the central city of Raleigh in 2005 essentially had the same income as those who lived in the suburbs. In Boston, the typical suburban resident had 1.5 times the income of the typical central city Boston resident. In Detroit, it was almost 2 to 1. In Hartford, it was 2.6 to 1. Very poor city, much richer suburbs. If you looked at the percentage change in median family income between 2005 for the central cities, you'll see that cities like San Francisco saw a very significant rise, a 30% increase in their real standard of living in central cities. Boston, practically none. It's between 1969 and 2005. But that practically none was significantly better than in other communities. Look at my city of Detroit. Between 69, just before I left for Boston, and 2005, in the central city, the typical family income has 35% less buying power than it did back then. Hartford, over 40%. Stunning. And one of the things we want to talk about in this class, and it will pepper throughout all of these discussions, is why? Why such massive differences in trajectories? Why such massive differences in prosperity? What makes cities prosper and what does not? If we look at the suburbs, we see Austin tops all of these cities with median family income growing by over 85%. Detroit, even in the suburbs over that long period of time, saw a growth of 4%. 1/20th of what we saw in Austin. Boston, around 30% in the suburbs. And then finally, if we look at median family income in 1969 versus 2005 in central cities, you'll see that in some central cities, like San Francisco, you've seen great growth in median family income. That's the far left bar. The purple bar is much higher than the blue bar. And then you see in others, for instance, Atlanta and Tucson, about the same. And in cities like Detroit, Buffalo, Hartford, Milwaukee, as you would have seen from the previous chart, incomes have fallen dramatically. The blue line of 1969, blue bar, is significantly higher than the purple bar of 2005. So some cities high and rising, other cities low, lower and falling. And here's the same in suburbs. But you might also say, we've just so far been looking at the real incomes of people. How does it compare with the cost of living? Well, it turns out, and this was really fascinating to me, if you looked at 2005 and you looked at four-person families and you said, well, for a whole metro area, not the central city, but the whole metro area, where do you have the highest income relative to the cost of living? It's Hartford, Connecticut. A city with with suburbs of only moderate income, but a much lower cost of living because of the cost of housing and so forth. Detroit is way up there, 1.4. But if you look at Boston, we're at 1.14, which is to say the median family income is only 14% higher than what it costs a family of four to have a basic budget. Big difference. And the cost of living, we're going to come back to, is critically important. So what are the key urban issues? We're going to be dealing with foreign immigration. Immigration plays an important role in Boston, as it does in some other cities. We're going to look at the decentralization of metro areas that occurred in the 1950s and 60s, and now the question is, will that continue or reverse? In some cities it's been reversing. We're going to look at urban flight and interregional migration between cities. Boston, as you'll see in one of our discussions from the latest research that I've been doing, actually has been losing population as a result of out-migration of existing residents, not immigration, but net out-migration. And that's true of all the cities with the highest cost of living. All 10 of the 350 metro areas with the highest cost of living lost population due to net out-migration. More people who live here leaving than coming in from other cities. Much of it due to the high cost of living. Question of social polarization within cities by race, ethnicity, how we use land and what we do to sustain our environment, transportation and infrastructure, urban education, crime and neighborhood security, housing affordability, fiscal conditions, civic engagement. A lot to talk about. But this is what we're going to be doing. And we're going to raise some key questions. Who has competitive advantage today? Which individuals? Which firms? Which areas? Why are some cities, some metro areas more successful than others in attracting industry and people? Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, versus indeed Boston, or certainly Detroit, or Toledo, or Flint, Michigan. Should we be saving cities or saving people? Do places count? There was a time when some people just said, well, let the cities die. Let's just make sure that the people survive. And in some places it made a lot of sense. If you were up in the Iron Range of northern Minnesota after taconite was no longer a major resource, it was very hard to think about the way you would restructure the Iron Range north of Duluth, where the winters are 40 below zero. Saving the people was very important. But should we not save cities? Who has access to resources? Who doesn't, and why? We need to talk about assets and income flows, political power and influence, elites, regimes. There's a constant battle over the competitive advantage. The use of market forces and political institutions to gain competitive advantage. Cities. We'll also be looking at market forces versus